He's the right rev of speed. Or the right rev of rev, as I like to sometimes, Jerry Bonkowski, NBCSports.com. And I know last week you were unavailable to come on the radio program and preview the race here in Brooklyn, Michigan and such. But before I do that, I want to congratulate you picking Martin Truex Jr. to win in Pocono. Hey, how did you know?
Just had a gut feeling. I mean, I totally forgot to pick pick a potential winner for Michigan. So I missed yesterday's race, but it was just a gut feeling. I mean, he does well at Pocono. He won there before last year, or won there last year, and I just thought he was going to do it again, and he did.
Well, I look at I remember, and so Truex, trying desperately to get back into the hunt, and of course the playoffs, I mean, it's, reseeded, so he'll be there with Harvick, who won a stage this past, up in Brooklyn and such, but I guess one of the things I did want to ask you about was Brad Keselowski. I know before this race, I was reading the headlines, 0-for-18, I believe it was, at his home track in Michigan. Now, that's kind of, odd. I wanted to ask, why do you think he has struggled so much over the years to try to win in Brooklyn, Michigan?
Well, I think a couple things. One, it's a different track than most of the other tracks. I mean, it's similar, obviously, to Fontana, but, it's not like a Talladega where he's won it. It's not a mile and a half track where he's won a bunch of, it's just a unique racetrack. And then, there's also kind of I think that we would be past that point by now, but I think there's still an essence of wanting to win in front of the home family, the home crowd, their friends, and all that kind of thing. And, even though he's done it for 18 starts already, there's still that pressure. And I think that, that potentially has, a way to gnaw at somebody, and they just can't seem to break through. I mean, another perfect example is Clint Bowyer with Kansas. He's never won there yet, and I mean that's literally in his backyard. So I think it's just a lot. It has a lot to do with the fact it was it's his home tracks, quote unquote, and he just has not had the kind of success that he's had at other tracks, primarily the mile and a half tracks.
Well, I do want to ask you this. Speaking of that, everybody talking about how great Bristol is and all this, but I come to think of it, I mean, Darrell Waltrip claimed it as his own, but he's not from the Tri-Cities. Have you ever heard of any driver? I mean, I know Brad Teague used to race here, Mike Potter and all this, but they weren't, upper echelon NASCAR drivers. Is there any driver that you would associate with Bristol as being the home driver of Bristol?
Oh, man, that's a tough one. I mean, we're talking about current drivers, right?
Yeah. Well, I was going to say current drivers, nobody's from the area. I mean, I know Martin McClure is just from right up the road in Abingdon, but it's not Martin McClure anymore. I mean, their heydays as a racing team has really gone down. I just was curious, is there somebody, and I was trying to think of, a real prominent driver, certainly in recent times from the Tri-Cities. I mean, I know that Joe Weatherly was once sponsored by Bristol Lincoln Mercury, but that's more than 50 years ago. Is there a Tri-Cities driver, someone from East Tennessee, Southwest Virginia, the Bristol area, that you would associate with the track?
Honestly, I can't think of anybody off the top of my head. I mean, I would associate a guy like Kyle Busch with Bristol just because he's won there so many times, in the various classes. But of course, he's from Las Vegas. He's not from Bristol, and he makes his home now in Charlotte. So, I mean, that's a real difficult question to answer because there just doesn't seem to be, any significant, successful drivers that are from the Tri-Cities area or even, the periphery of the Tri-Cities area,
Yeah, I mean, you get people from, say, Columbia, Tennessee, or, Sterling Marlin, or whatever, right. But I was thinking, that's Middle Tennessee, and, I mean, I know you're from Chicago. Well, there's a big difference between Chicago and Peoria. You know that.
We talked about this talking about.
Yeah, and it's the same thing. There's a big difference between East Tennessee and Middle Tennessee. We're the only state, by the way, I think that says middle. Everybody else is central, but we're middle, so we want to be special and all that. What was special about Clint Bowyer winning the race? Obviously, his decision to take 2 tires, that sort of, he's claiming that helped him win. Can you talk a little bit more about that strategy, taking only the 2 tires instead of the 4?
Well, his crew chief, Mike Buggerow, I can never pronounce his last name. Mike Buggerow, Mike Buggerovich, I can never get the name right. He is, to me, he's been one of the most unsung and, under or overlooked, I should say, crew chiefs out there in the game. And I think that, yesterday was a very gutsy call. It gets Clint his second win of the year. It shows that, you have to make or be ready to make a call like that in a split second because, everybody else, all the other crew chiefs seem to be looking at 4 tires as the right answer. But, Mike was on, watching the radar. He knew weather was in the area. He anticipated that the race was going to probably be stopped. So the main thing was to get his driver back out onto the racetrack from pit road as quickly as possible. And the only way you do that is go with 2 tires or go with no tires. But, Clint's tires had been pretty much worn out at that point, so he had to go with some. And 2 was just the right strategy, if you will, to get him back on track and get him on the track to get the lead. And then, I think, what was it? I can't remember the number of laps they had, but it was only like maybe 13, I think it was, or something like that, before the rain came. And that was then, NASCAR called the race at that point. So it was really a good strategy. And, like I said, I consider him a long time underrated crew chief. And I think that, we're starting to see why he should have a lot more notoriety and recognition because he's doing a very good job. And the other thing, too, is let's not forget that this was a 1-2-3 Stewart Haas Racing finish, which I think is the first time we've had 3 drivers finish 1-2-3 from the same team. I think in like 12 years or 13 years. I think the last time was Roush back in 2006. So, kudos to Stewart Haas Racing because you had Bowyer winning, Kevin Harvick was second, and Kurt Busch, the pole sitter, was third. So, they got it done. Sure, the race, had the race been able to do the full 200 laps, they would have been able to finish another 67 more laps rather than cutting it short after 133. Who knows if the outcome would have been the same, but, it definitely shows the strength of Stewart Haas and, with the way we've seen the success from Harvick this year, I just think that you're going to see even more and greater success from Stewart Haas, and to me, they're the organization to beat right now.
Yeah, I agree with you. I know that people are talking about, but it seems like all the time those are the drivers that's the team that is always winning. And there was a lot of news, at the start of the year about, hey, Bubba Wallace is driving for Richard Petty. Isn't that cool? It is. But they just, why do you think, does Stewart Haas have significantly more money? I know they do more than Petty, but the old, the Penske's, the Gibbs and all that, why have they not been able to match the performance of Stewart Haas this year, in your opinion, Jerry Bonkowski?
That's a good question. I don't know if there really is a good answer to explain that because, like I said, they've got great people behind the wheel and also in the pit box, so that's one good thing in their favor. And that's not to say that, other teams like Joe Gibbs Racing or Penske or Richard Childress Racing or Roush don't have good people. They do. They all have good people, but it just seems like the chemistry is just so spot on at Stewart Haas, not only among, the Harvick team, but also among all the 4 teams they have there. Almirola could do a little bit better, but still, they've had a very strong season overall, and they're definitely, fairly almost all of them are contenders. Excuse me, except with the exception of Almirola, he has to get his situation a little bit, better. But I think they're all contenders to make the playoffs and potential contenders to win the championship as well too.
Well, Jerry Bonkowski, hey, Stewart Haas doesn't want to change this at all, certainly. One thing, though, about this race that I found, and I found it intriguing and very exciting, it was what stage racing is supposed to be. And two things. First of all, now that you have to have before you can call a race because of rain, 2 stages complete. I do kind of like that. I do like it that it has to be more than half than what it was before half. I guess it's part of my idea that I've always said, why can you call a baseball game after 5 innings? You're supposed to play 9. Why is it suddenly because the weather is bad you can get away with only playing 5? I mean, in theory, that has never made a lot of sense to me. So having as much of a completion as you possibly can, I think is important, my opinion, okay? But the other thing I wanted to ask about this, during the stages, Ryan Blaney won the first stage. It was not the first time he's won, but I thought that was a significant thing because, this was supposed to be a year where Blaney was supposed to sort of make his mark, but he really hasn't so far. It's all been about, Busch and Harvick. And I just, the significance, if any, of Blaney winning that first stage. What were your thoughts?
Well, the way I look at it is, stage racing, it has proven to be a very good thing for NASCAR, but just because you win a stage doesn't mean you're going to be around for the checkered flag, and that, we've seen that many, many times, over the course of the last 2 years with the history of stage racing. So, I mean, it puts you in a favorable position by winning the stage, and you get a few extra bonus points as well, too, but, it doesn't mean that you're going to go on to win, as we saw yesterday. I mean, now, again, going back to what I said a few moments ago, had this race been able to go longer or maybe even a full completion of the 200 laps that were scheduled, Blaney could have been there, potentially at the end, to win this race. So, the thing is, it's not just Blaney this year. I mean, excuse me. A lot of the other younger drivers are just really struggling. I mean, Eric Jones, Daniel Suarez, they're the Dillon brothers. They're not having the year that NASCAR predicted of these young gun drivers, and we're seeing. I don't want to say more of the same, but we're seeing the grizzled veterans showing the young guys that, hey, if you want to get to the top, you're going to have to go around me or get through me. Much like Harvick and Kyle Busch, guys like that. So, it's good to have to develop bigger fan bases, I guess is probably the best way to phrase it, for these young drivers. But I think in the same breath, though, you're kind of putting a little bit more pressure on them to succeed because, we're hearing so much about, this is the year of the young driver. Chase Elliott's going to do this, and he hasn't. I mean, there's just so many names that we can go down the list here that just have not had the season that, that was kind of forecast for them. And I think that, this, kind of in a twisted way, if you will, and I don't mean twisted in a bad way, I mean in a good way, in a kind of a good twisted way, it kind of served to give, added incentive to the older drivers like a Kevin Harvick and Kyle Busch to, just say, hey, forget these young drivers, we're out here and we're going to show that we are still the best, and it's going to be a long time before these young up-and-comers are going to overtake us and, knock us up our throne, if you will.
I don't think that's such a bad thing. I really don't. And we've had this conversation before, but, you don't in baseball suddenly, embrace the rookie of the year and then throw out all the old veterans.
Exactly.
And I always say, here's somebody who's established. And I've told you, I mean, when I'm a little boy, my first sports heroes are Willie Stargell and Terry Bradshaw, and they were well in the second half of their careers, but, they had an established brand. I think that, Kevin Harvick, Kyle Busch, Martin Truex Jr., Jimmy Johnson. I mean, I am more concerned, I would say, if I'm NASCAR, about Jimmy Johnson not winning and asking, is he Dale Earnhardt in 1997, where he came back the next year to win the Daytona 500, or is he Dale Earnhardt Jr. late in his career when, it just, you think he might win this one? No, that sort of thing. And, losing Lowe's, you gotta start wondering, I mean, is it in the cards for Johnson to be competitive again? And I think that hurts the sport more right now than, Chase Elliott is still, he hasn't gotten the checkered flag yet. My opinion.
Well, yeah, but, to I mean, let's go back in time to Richard Petty's days. I mean, he won the 7th championship. What was it, 1984? I want to say it was maybe.
Won his last race in '83, I think it was. Petty won his last race in 1983 to give him an even 200. I think.
But he went almost a decade without winning a race, and certainly not winning the championship as well, too. And he finally retired after the '92 season. I mean, Jimmy Johnson has been a fantastic representative and ambassador for the sport. He's been, a very extremely successful driver in the sport. He's won 7 championships. He's tied with Petty and Earnhardt. But, like I was saying about Petty and to an extent Earnhardt, when you get older, your career starts.
Sure.
What goes up must come down. Is basically what I'm trying to get at. And I still think Jimmy Johnson. I still have several more wins in him. I still think he has the potential for one more championship, but it's been a very difficult season for him. And does that mean that maybe he is on the downward slide of his career? That he's maybe he only has another 2-3 more years, if that. You can make an argument for that, but I still think that once he gets things back together and back on the right plane, if you will, like he's done in the past, he'll be a formidable opponent. And all he has to do is get himself in the playoffs, and he could be one of the top contenders, even though he's had a rough start to the first, what's it been, 13 races or whatever we're through already. So yeah, I think he still has a very strong potential to make the playoffs and to go for that 8th championship, but he's just having difficulties, and it's not unusual when a driver's been around this long. But then again, you can make the same argument. Well, why is Jimmy struggling and Kevin Harvick is doing great, very well when they're both? Well, actually, Harvick's actually older than Johnson, but it's just kind of the cycle, the cyclical aspect of this sport where you're great for a long period of time, and then things just are not great that much anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I've always felt that most sports, 40 is when, wait a minute, when you get to 40, you're on borrowed time. That's when they, and we hear this a lot with, say, Tom Brady. And if anybody, I think, can play until he's 45, it is Tom Brady. But you keep hearing how the Patriots are sort of like saying, or at least Bill Belichick, you really want to come back again, Tom? I mean, this could be that year, But in NASCAR, I always thought it was 50. Was where, that was when you were on borrowed time and such. My opinion, again, I guess, growing up, seeing Dick Trickle go in many years, well into his 50s, that sort of thing, has influenced me. Then again, I can think of 2 tragedies befalling 50-year-old racers in J.D. McDuffie and Dale Earnhardt Sr. Hey, I know you've been covering the NHRA. I wanted to ask you this. Did you see this? Speaking of young and old, I mean, I'll give you the memory of the 1988 Daytona 500 with Bobby beating Davey Allison, his son. Did you see this at the Virginia NHRA Nationals that Courtney Force beat her dad John yesterday up in Dinwiddie, Virginia, or down in Dinwiddie at the Virginia Motorsports Park in the funny car victory? I just was curious, have you seen this? And I know you're doing NHRA. Have you ever been around the Forces?
Oh, I know them very well. I know all of them very well. I've known John for well over 30 years, and it was very good to see not only Courtney winning her 4th race of the season, but John was in the final with her, and he has struggled. He's had probably the worst year he's ever had, or the worst year he's had since 2007. That was the year he had a real bad accident in Texas, but he struggled for a good chunk of that year, especially the second half. But this year has been just an absolute struggle for him, and he'd been out of the top 10 all the whole season, and finally now he's I think he's 8th, I think, after yesterday's runner-up finish. It's good. He had a runner-up finish in Charlotte in the 4 Wide Nationals about a month and a half or so ago, but that was kind of like, to me, a little bit of an aberration, because you have 4 cars in the same run as opposed to the normal 2. So and the other thing too about it is that he did not go easy on his daughter. He gave it everything he and his car had. That was a classic drag race yesterday. Courtney, she just beat her dad, and it was by a split second, and maybe a mile or 2 mile per hour, and that was it. It was just that close. So it was good to see not only her winning, like I said, but to see John, back in the final round, and this could be very much of a turnaround for him. He crashes, or is it 4 more? No, that's right. No, 3 and 3 up to now, and so that shows you how rough the season he's had. But he looked like vintage John Forrest yesterday when he was racing against Courtney.
It was a great story. I mean, the daughter beating father and all this, and you telling the story of the drag race right there is a lot of fun. One final question for you. Let's go back to NASCAR. They got an off week this week. Does NASCAR need more of these, or even fewer races on the schedule? What are your thoughts? I mean, that's always discussed.
I've long advocated to have as many, if maybe not a few more races, but actually, Marky, over the last year or so, I've kind of started changing my perspective on that. I think that 36 races, it really is a lot of racing, and then plus you had the duel in Daytona, you've got the All-Star race, so you're actually looking at a 38 race season for most of the teams. And I think we're at a point now that there's just such an overload of all sports out there that it might behoove NASCAR maybe to cut a few races. I mean, I've talked to fans over the years, and some feel that the magic number is either 32, maybe even 30 races, and I think that that might enhance the sport's popularity a little bit more, because there's a lot of times where fans may not even know where they're racing at on a particular weekend, and that's the thing the sport does not want to have. They want fans to be on top of everything, knowing where they're going to the next race and all that kind of thing, who's leading the standings, who won the last race, things like that. So I would not be surprised that that there have been discussions perhaps to maybe decrease the size of the schedule, maybe make it a 32 race schedule. I think that would be good. I think that this is such a demanding series that you can never get enough off time, especially during the off season. I mean, during the season rather. So when you do have an off weekend like we have coming up here, you relish that, you welcome that. So I think that I wouldn't say in the next couple of years, but I would think maybe by the time we maybe hit 2021, 2022, somewhere in that area, I wouldn't be surprised if we go from 36 races maybe down to 34, maybe even 32.
It's a little sad maybe, but if that does happen. But I'll just say this, Jerry. I mean, when I look at the economy and what the feedback is, I go to the tried and true member, ask the cab drivers. And I'm talking to the cab drivers around here. They haven't made a big killing off the track since the Battle of Bristol football game in September of 2016. That's what they're telling me. Not even the night races in August and all that. So something to think about there. How much does it really affect the economy?
I'll say this, though. If NASCAR does cut, a couple races or a few races, whatever, hopefully they won't take one of the races away from Bristol.
Oh, yeah. Well, certainly. Well, it goes without saying. Can't do that, right? I mean, it is $5 extra for the cab driver.
Exactly.
Yeah. Even when there are only the 10,000 people there that occurred in the spring here in the cold weather. But anyway, Tri-City Sports. Now I'm going to tell you about that baseball line that hasn't been done in 105 years. When we return, I'll be broadcasting on Facebook, on my own personal Facebook page, and close out the show, Tri-City Sports Now. There you go. Thank you.